Hi, and welcome to the third installment of our monthly interview series, Conversations with Bill. I'm Anne Mamaghani, a proud graduate of the MS HFID program at Bentley University. In this third installment, we'll be talking with Bill about the core foundations of HFID that are evergreen. This series is dedicated to capturing Bill's incredible legacy before his retirement. Each month, a different HFID advisory board member from the program will sit down with Bill to discuss specific topics related to his journey and his immense impact on the field of human factors and information design. Our goal is to create short, bite-sized content that provides deep insights and reflections from Bill. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for taking the time to do this. This has been a blast.
Oh, of course. Yeah, we're all really excited about it. And I'm really excited for this conversation today and what we can really talk about and learn from you about our core foundations of HFID. So, to start that off, I'd love to ask you first off, from your perspective, what are the fundamental principles of human factors that every practitioner should understand?
Yeah, and that hasn't changed over the years. So for those of you who were in the program 25 years ago, I think we've expanded the range, and we can talk about that as we move along with some of the new emerging technologies where new human elements come into play that weren't relevant. I mean, they were always there, but they weren't relevant, 25 years ago. But some of the core things in terms of how people, sense the world, how people interact with products, that hasn't changed. And that's the wonderful thing about human factors. There's a lot of things that we can focus on in terms of, particularly in the design world that's so fluid and it's constantly changing. It was a design library, a standard became a pattern library. It's become a design system, and we feel this need to reinvent everything every 5 years. And there's fundamentals of design that just haven't changed since I studied design 45 years ago. But the nice thing about human factors is human behavior stays pretty constant. I mean, there will always be new contextual things, like the effects of social media on children, where we have to look at their mental health and things like that emerge because of the technologies. But people's mental health has always been there. It was other things that were affecting it. So I think that's the nice thing about it, that human factors as a whole, human perception, how we perceive the world, how we take that input and how we process it cognitively, and then how we act upon that, and whether it be learning and changing our thinking, or actually physically responding in a certain way, that those basic principles have not changed. So the beauty of studying this, and maybe it was because I was lazy that I wanted to learn something once and then apply it for 40 years. But once you learn this stuff, you can literally apply it. And I think what's exciting, and maybe one of the things I'm going to miss besides my students, when I retire, is, the technology that's coming along today, and thinking about it. We were just talking about it in 700 last night, how, 25 years ago, yeah, we would talk about depth, but we were talking about a two-dimensional interface. And now we're talking about depth in a way that has real value, with like a heads-up display or augmented reality or virtual reality, where we really need to facilitate that in the design. So I think there's exciting things coming along today. That human robot interaction is another area that just fascinates me. And I'm going like, how is that's going to happen? And how is that going to occur? AI from a human factors perspective is less interesting. I think it's going to affect the field in absolutely critical ways. But I do worry about the dehumanizing effect. So that's not so much human factors as it is just, understanding human behavior. When the machine starts to take over, we're going to lose that ability. And so that dehumanizing aspect of that, I think, is something that we're going to have to look at more going forward. But coming back to your point, most of it remains the same. And that's it. It really is the product. If you think about the product of human evolution, who we are today is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. And, what we're experiencing today in our lifetime, or over the 40 years I've been in the field, is a blip. It's a tiny little blip. We like to think that, oh, it's all because of what's coming along, and the computers and all of this. And no, it's not. It's the product of everything that came before, and we're just applying into these new technologies. So humans have not changed radically. Around the edges, as I said earlier, yes, there'll be some changes, but fundamentally we remain the same. So if we keep focused on that, you're not terrified by the change that's coming. You're saying like, wow, it's just an interesting to me. Technology has always been an artifact. I've never been. I'm not a technology geek. To me, technology has always been an artifact where I can observe and study and examine how people interact with that artifact. And so each new technology just becomes a new artifact where we apply those human factors. Many of them the same. Again, we expand, the range of things that we're looking at because there's greater relevance, but it remains fundamentally the same.
Okay. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about some of those that definitely stay the same and that are specific to the principles there.
Yeah, I mean, again, just the most basic things. What's fresh in my mind right now is, what I'm teaching in human factors over the 700 class over the first 3 weeks, and we started diving into perception. So understanding the way the perceptual system works as a difference detector, and the role of contrast, how we perceive depth in the world, that hasn't changed. I mean, again, how somebody, a hunter gatherer, 1,000 years ago or several thousand years ago, was, hunting and, foraging in the forest, and how they would perceive, forms, and how they would perceive depth as they were, engaged in the hunting task. That is no different than the way we perceive depth in an augmented reality environment. It's the
Mhm,
same perceptual system. So again,
mhm.
understanding that, from a cognitive perspective, how we're really a prediction machine, set, based on our expectations, which are shaped by what's in our heads. That's never changed. We've always been learning a learning, species, and what we acquire in our head, and what sets us apart from other animals, is the fact that we learn and we evolve. Some usually in a good way, not always in a good way, but usually. But then we apply that learning to new experiences, and it sets our expectations. So it's always about predictions. We're trying to predict what's coming next by a sample that we're taking in from our environment, and that's driven by efficiency. We've always had limited cognitive resources, attentional resources, thinking resources to bring to bear on the world. So we want to use those as efficiently as possible. So we have evolved to become these kinds of prediction machines, really taking in a small sample, matching it up against what's in our head, and then predicting the outcome and our response. That has not changed.
Nice. Okay, thank you. You did mention that as technology changes, though, you did allude to some changes when it comes to human factors or the core principles. I'm curious what those areas of change are.
Yeah, it is. So, again, we'd have very simple, 20 years ago, we'd have very simple discussions of depth.
Hmm.
And it was really like how, as an illustration, you would use different shading techniques to create the illusion of depth in a sphere or any kind of object. Today we're actually creating those kinds of experiences virtually in augmented reality and virtual reality. To understand that, how do you engineer that headset to provide that right sensation, to create the illusion of that reality? That is critical. We need to understand that now at a much deeper level than shading a sphere with a piece of charcoal 25 years ago. So we're actually engineering the technology to simulate that sensation. And that requires a very, very, very deep understanding. The multimodal design is another space. So 20 years ago, we would talk about, we would talk a little bit about grip. So I can remember, Chauncey in the program with his little block of wood talking about the palm device, how the person who designed the first palm device carried around the block of wood and put it in his pocket, and so on and so forth, and gripped it and grasped it and manipulated it. So that was pretty simple, notion of interacting with things, or what a button shape should be. But now we're talking about, multimodal design, and we're talking about wearable technology, and again, we're talking about, as working with somebody not too long ago where they're talking about in body armor, we're sending certain sensations to the torso. I would never imagine 25 years ago I would be talking about designing for stimulating the abdomen. But now we are. And how
Hmm.
is the sensory system there, the nerve endings and the torso, that part of the torso, how is it different than the fingertips? And how is that different than the wrist where we might be wearing, a smartwatch? And then understanding that system very deeply so that we can understand what is the sensitivity, and then based on that sensitivity, what is the information bandwidth? What is the capacity to deliver information? And then thinking about it, working with, applications in the military where, they have heads up displays, they're getting voice in through their headphones. They're seeing things in augmented reality before them. They're seeing, again, things that are reality in the environment. They're getting vibrations, to their torso, through their body armor. At what point is it too much? And we talk about this even in automotive design, with increasing frequency, in the 700 class, that you have steering wheels that vibrate, that send you one message. You have seats that vibrate that are sending you a different message. You have a number of different video cameras and you're processing that. You have this large center display. You could have a heads up display on some windshields. When is it too much? When is it not serving a function or usefulness and delivering value? And when does it actually become a detriment? So again, in the case
Hmm.
of the automobile, traffic fatalities for the first time in 20 plus years have now increased. And how much
Right.
of that is attributable to bad design? So I think a lot of this now has just been unleashed, and
Hmm.
and and nobody's kind of minding the store. You've got somebody
Hmm.
who's designing that vibrating seat, and you've got somebody else who's designing the center console, and another team that is designing the video input, and nobody overseeing that and orchestrating that and saying, like, okay, what I understand what each one's doing individually, and each one individually has, where you can build a compelling case of the value that it delivers, but combined, when can it be problematic, and when can it
Right.
actually affect human performance and safety in a negative way? So I think all of that in the technology is just, again, we have this tremendous capability, and the capability is always ahead of our understanding of that
Hmm.
human interaction with that capability. And that part
Hmm.
maybe hasn't changed. I think it's more sophisticated today, but I can remember when, touch screens, first came in for medical devices. And I can remember interviewing anesthesiologist who's saying, like, my job is so much more difficult today, and my job is so much more dangerous today, because the most important thing for me is eyes on the patient to see how they're
Hmm.
responding to the surgery and the medications and all of that. Um, it used to be that I would reach over and there would be physical buttons, and I would know what each button did, and it'd be a slider, and I know each click on that slider would administer this much more of this medication or that. And I'd be able to do it without taking my eyes off the patient. The problem with
Right.
a touch screen, just like in the automobile. So again, same
Hmm.
problem, new technology 20 years later, same outcome. It's dangerous. When we're taking
Right.
our eyes off the road and focusing on that center console, or taking our eyes off
Hmm.
the patient and focusing on that touch screen. So same problem 20 years later, applied in a different way, but the same
Right.
outcome. So human factors should anticipate that. That's what human factors is all about, is not saying, like, oh, center consoles in an automobile are completely new, so I got to start with a blank slate. No, no, what have we learned before? And the same
Right.
thing with autonomous vehicles, or we're right now dealing with semi-autonomous vehicles. 20 years ago, Donald Norman said humans are bad in semi-autonomous environments. And he was talking about airplanes, again,
Hmm.
where airplanes were, basically flying themselves, but they always had them take control at certain points. But that's a dangerous thing. Humans are
Right.
good either being on or off. And that hasn't
Hmm.
changed. That's never
Right.
changed. We're not good in this gray area in between. So you can have all the warnings in the automobile that you want, that when you start it up, that it, the console says, like, oh, yes, it's an autonomous mode, but be prepared to take over at a moment's notice. And you can have all of these warnings. Humans are going to behave like humans. and they do
Right.
not respond well in that kind of environment. So I can go
Right.
on and give you those examples, but this is what human factors is all about, is not waiting for something to go wrong, but predicting that it's going to happen, that there's a high probability. And you may or may not remember, but we talked about that in 700, saying like when soon as there's a high probability and predictability that something could go wrong, it's our responsibility to fix it. Okay.
Right.
Not to wait for it to go wrong and then blame it on human error. Human
Right.
factors is to get ahead of that, predict it, and respond. Be
Mm-hmm.
proactive. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it's so interesting to me because everything that you're talking about is also, sometimes we can just assume that's a problem even when a human is at their best, right? But
Oh
think
my
about an
God, yeah.
overtired human or a human who's, worked too many hours or whatever the situation is, right? We only have so much in our cognitive capacity and in our entire, ability to show up and do things in the best of situations, much
Right.
less
And
when we're compromised in any way.
exactly. And again, there's so many things involved there, stress and fatigue. So, whether we look at, the healthcare system and look at the number of errors that occur at the end of 14-hour day for a doctor versus when they're fresh
Hmm.
at the beginning of the day. And the research is
Hmm.
very clear. You don't want to be the last person to have surgery for the day. You want to be
Right.
that person first thing in the morning. The evidence and the data is quite clear that errors occur, more frequently as people become more fatigued. Yet we have a system where, and it's not just healthcare. We see, in law enforcement, for example, is, where most police departments are so understaffed that you have police officers who are working, 14, 18-hour shifts, and they're forced to do so. They have no
Right.
choice.
Yeah.
And then they're making life and death decisions. We know
Hmm.
people are incapable, whether you're, again, same problem, different environment. Doctors make bad situation decisions when they fatigue, they respond more slowly. The same thing with a police officer. And
Right.
again, and then when things go wrong, what do? We blame the human.
Hmm.
But again, we should figure this out and figure out how do we design a system. In the case of doctors, their argument is, continuity of care, that again, patients are more likely to die when you're handing off from one doctor to another, from
Hmm.
one shift to another. The data is very clear there. So the continuity of care is saying that you stay with your patient if it's 18 hours, 20 hours, until they're stable.
Right.
They've identified the problem, they've identified the wrong solution. The solution is, how do we facilitate handoffs?
Hmm.
How do we do a
Nice.
better job
Yeah.
so that when somebody comes in fresh at the end of at the start of an 8-hour shift, that somebody doesn't die? That
Right.
shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen.
Right.
In fact, it should be a better response when that person is fresh at the start of their shift. But the
Hmm.
problem is facilitating that handoff, the process of facilitating that handoff. And that's what human factors does, is doesn't slap a band-aid on it. It tries to get to the root of the problem and solve the root of the problem.
Right. That's great. Yeah. Also, you spoke to that tremendous responsibility and illustrated it really well with a lot of really good examples. And I recall from the program something that really stayed with me, and you made in my experience, made a great impression on us in terms of, hey, you may not always have all of this information at your fingertips about, the way that humans are processing the information. You may be in a situation that's new, but be able to get your hands on the literature, right? Go to the literature. Also, I think that you emphasize that also as a means of convincing our colleagues, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes we're in situations where maybe we may be the lone voice of everything that you just described, right? We may be the only ones who are saying this. And I remember you impressing very clearly, like you can go to the literature, know how to
Yeah.
get to it. You don't have to know every single, core principle down to the letter, but you need to be able to find it and you need to be able to make a case for it. And that made a huge impression on me. And to this day, I'm still pulling out core principles sometimes and presenting them to executives and other groups just so that, really to make that impression both, hey, here's the core principle, here's how we're
Yeah.
violating it. And also, hey, there's some credibility here to this, right? It's not just me saying this.
Yeah, and there's power in that. So, a couple things, teasing out of what your comment is, one is the ability to find it, one to know it exists. And I was again just chatting with the students last night where they're overwhelmed by the readings, and I'm going, okay, I don't expect you to remember all these formulas. There's not going to be a midterm. I'm going to be very transparent about it, but I want you to know they exist. so that if
Mhm.
you're in an environment where you need this, you'll know how to find it. Because that's what you're learning in this class. You're learning how to, you know, you know, create a query, structure a query in such a way that you can find this research and rely from reliable sources. So again,
Mhm.
the ability to do that is an important skill that you take away. Then the second part is how do you share that? And again, you have to be very diplomatic about it. You never lead with the neuroscience. You lead with a general principle like, how about if we did it this way? And then
Mhm.
when they push back saying like, no, that's your opinion, my opinion is this, and then you're going like, okay, so this is not a matter of opinion. This is it's neuroscience, but you drill down and you talk about them principles. And if they're still digging their
Mhm.
heels, and you say, okay, here's the way we're designed neurologically. And this hasn't changed over thousands of years, and it has nothing to do with opinion. This is the way we work naturally. Now, you don't lead with that because people will run and hide when they see you coming down the hallway. But for some people, you have to do that, particularly in the world
Right.
that we're playing in, where you have some really kind of pig-headed, technical people where they're very opinionated and they dig in and they're very resistant to change. So again, having that evidence, and I've always called it informed design. Design
Mhm.
that is informed by science. Not expect not expert opinion, not best practice, not conventional practice, so on and so forth, but informed by science. And that's what human factors is about. That's what human computer interaction is about. This, I think, is the problem in the UX field, is that we do not have that scientific underpinning.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's been unique about the Bentley program is we took this emerging field of UX and we married it to human factors and
Mhm.
HCI. We gave it that theoretical scientific underpinning. And it's not just theory. I hate it when people say, well, it's just theory. No, it's theory is explaining the way we behave as humans. And again, our whole goal is to design a system that is compatible with the way people behave naturally.
Right. Yeah.
So we can't do this. We can't operate without that theoretical underpinning, whatever it is. And I think that's been one of the unique things about the Bentley program.
Absolutely. That theoretical underpinning. And then also, like you said, connecting that with UX. But then, for me, it even went a step further. And I know for, everyone in the program to exactly what you just did also, which is the practical application of
Mm,
that, right? Like, hey, in reality, there was a lot of discussion in class, everything, that was very, more theoretical and academic and the psychological principles. But on top of that, in classes and everywhere else, there was always this opportunity to understand how to apply this in real world
yeah,
scenario, right? You're
yeah,
you're
yeah,
in a corporate environment or another type of environment, and you have to really make this work. And how do you do that? And so that's something that has been tremendously valuable for me. In being able to be ready to work when I graduated, and even this many years later, still,
yeah.
ready to apply because it wasn't just theory; it was everything, the practical application on top of that as well.
Yeah, and I think I shared this with Tomer in the last episode, but I think that was a failing on my part early on that I just assumed everybody kind of made the connection between theory and practice and what I was doing in the design reviews and 700, that it was clear that you were learning a theory, but then you were applying it to the evaluation of a product. And I don't think it was clear, and that was my fault. And it always kind of irked me when people say like, "Oh, I hate those papers." I'm going like, "They're not papers; they're design reviews. They're design reviews with scientific evidence." And I've done, I think, a better job, and I think students are getting that more so today. And again, if you looked at a human factors course in any other school, I think in the world, I think 95% of them will have a midterm and a final. And that's what you do. You learn all this theory and you
Sure.
spit it back on a midterm and a final, and then you never use it again. And most of it's going
Mhm.
to be forgotten. What you do in 700 is you learn a module of behavior, and then you apply it to the evaluation and making recommendations for correcting problems in a product design. So you
Mhm.
are making that connection to practice. So we've always tried to do that, not just have it operate in a vacuum, but apply it to actual product design.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it came through loud and clear for me, and I'm really grateful for that. It's been something that's been invaluable for me throughout my career, which I'm really grateful for. Something else I'd love to ask you about is, talking about these core principles of human factors and how they're applied. Do you have a particular favorite one that's sort of like your pet principle or something that you particularly appreciate?
Yeah, I think overall, and 40 years later, and again, I keep coming back to our shared with the students last night. I've been a lot more open in my experience and sharing with the students, but I still marvel. I mean, the way the system works. I mean, it's just amazing that, from a photon of light that strikes the retina and then it travels up to the brain and it produces this effect, and it does so flawlessly, and it does so in milliseconds, and it does it the same way across all populations. We should all just every once in a while take a moment and pause and just marvel that this system
Yeah.
works the way. Now, right down to the cell level, that these cells are specialized, that keep feeding things forward in a predictable, reliable way. Not that things don't go wrong every now and
Hmm.
again, but largely it works. And if it didn't largely work, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
We would have perished a long time ago, and it's the product of evolution that we've done that. So one, I think, is I do still, after 40 years or more, actually, if you include graduate school, I still marvel at the way the system works. And I'm
Hmm.
always discovering new insights and things like that. I think the things that I do have kind of favorites, and I think they're things that have been neglected and ignored in our field, and some people might, disagree with me, but we can talk about that. Is one is accessibility. Again, understanding, and as I said, sometimes the system doesn't work. There's kind of a core way that humans behave, and most of us behave that way. And then there's exceptions. There's exceptions perceptually, where we have the seeing impaired, the hearing impaired, the physically impaired, and then we have people who are cognitively impaired. So where things are not behaving like that, typical way that we designed for. And then how do we make the appropriate accommodations? How do we recognize that? And how do we then build in, the design support so that our technology is accessible to all? And I think we made a mistake in our field, in the origins, going back 35, 40 years ago, where we kind of handed that off to somebody else. Somebody else took care of accessibility. It wasn't
Yeah.
our core responsibility as an interaction designer. And I think that one, to me, is something that's near and dear to me, because we're talking about tens of millions of people. And I think
Hmm.
like 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't a problem because the vast majority of people didn't use technology, and it wasn't critical to, kind of healthy, satisfying life. But today, where everything is technology enabled, governmental services, the courts, healthcare, financial well-being, everything, your ability to vote in this democracy, it all relies on technology. And the fact that we're marginalizing tens of millions of people is inexcusable.
Yeah.
We just have to keep reminding ourselves that anything that we design and create has to be accessible to all. I think we
Yeah.
could get away with that in the past and people wouldn't suffer. People are suffering today. So we've always talked about the digital divide, and it was like the haves and haves not. You have a computer, you don't. Everybody has greater access to the technology today. The divide is not technological so much as it is design. There's a design
Right.
divide, that we are not making and designing and creating products that are accessible to all. So I think that's one that's near and dear to me. And again, particularly on the cognitive side. So I've spent a lot of time looking at cognitive impairment. And looking at, and again, they range from, people who need some very, very serious, assistive technologies, to people who just need some support, maybe in the aging process. So everything plays
Hmm.
out on a continuum. But then even looking at, neurodivergence, and again, all of that plays out on a continuum in terms of people who suffer, from ADHD or autism and so on and so forth, and looking at that and saying, okay, how do those, states, how do those affect information processing and interacting, with the things again that we design and create, and how can we make them more accessible to all? And it starts with an understanding. That's what human factors is. It's that understanding. So everybody has that understanding. It's not a specialized group that if we get to it, that would be great, but most times we don't get to it. So that's one that's near and dear to me. The other one is internationalization, globalization, localization, whatever you want to call it, goes by many different names. But we still tend to think about, and I'm sorry, you're going to hear my dog whining in the background here. She's growing impatient with me. But
Or it would be
this
mine.
this is something that is very near and dear to me, is that we still tend to, when we talk about human factors and human computer interaction and user experience, more often than not, we're talking about Western human factors, Western user experience,
Yeah.
Western human computer interaction. It's all
Hmm.
based on research that has been done here, primarily in the US and Europe, maybe to a lesser extent. And we haven't considered most of the world's populations and how people learn differently, how people, communicate differently, how people form social networks differently, how people deal with risk and failure differently, and on and on and on. We know there's difference. We know there's tremendous difference there, and we're
Hmm.
not taking that into account. And again, what did we do? And this is a failing of our discipline, is that we handed that off. We handed that off and say in every tech company, there's a localization group. And
Hmm.
what does that organizational decision say about us? That we have a user experience group and a human factors group, but they're only focused on US users or Western users. The rest of the world has to go to this localization group. And then
Right.
you talk to these localization groups and they start talking about, okay, now we're going to take this product and we're going to localize it, because very few people build world-ready product. But so it's a US-based product that's then localized, and then they start making business decisions. What's the
Hmm.
return on investment in here? How large is this population? So how much effort should we put into it? We don't make those kind of decisions when we're talking about US-based domestic users. That's user experience.
Hmm.
So I think, again, we've kind of been kidding ourselves. We call it user experience when it's, that you're fully functioning in terms of the accessibility and you look like us.
Right.
And that's not user experience. That's not a human experience. Human includes everybody.
Right.
So I think
Yeah.
those are two that are near and dear to me. And if there's any, I think, disappointment in my career, is that we haven't made more progress in those areas. We know how to do it. We
Hmm.
know how to know how to do it. We choose either not to even recognize it or try, or it becomes a business decision, and that's wrong.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you make an excellent case for that. And having done both internationalization and globalization research and also accessibility research, it's stark when you're in those moments, right? Where you're with somebody who's struggling with a product that wasn't designed for them
Hmm.
and watching the struggle, right, firsthand in some type of
Oh yeah,
study or that sort
no,
of thing. It's
no,
it's very stark. And then you can see it. And those are you put your finger on the vulnerabilities of some of our most popular and ubiquitous, B2C products, right? Having, spent a lot of my career working on those,
yeah,
business to consumer products, right? You've really put your finger on the vulnerabilities there. And to your point, you can see it in the design of the org structures of these companies, right? And the
yeah.
way that things are set up. So I'm curious, you've made a fantastic case, in talking about this. What would you tell to, the sole practitioner, maybe someone like me, or, and at either a leadership level or, any level really, what to do about this, right? You're in some type of organization that's, designed this way and not really recognizing this situation. Love to understand what maybe one person or a few people can do who are human factors experts.
Yeah, no, I would really, I think for decades we've shied away from human factors, and I'll be honest with you, it
Yeah.
was a kind of a bold move for us to connect the two early on,
Mhm.
and then we started backing away from it as well. So we kind of went along with the market as well and shifted towards experience design, but it always had that very strong human component. But if I was starting out today, I doubled down on human factors. I would definitely, because again, going through the whole thing that we've talked about from the very beginning here today is that it's not going to change. It's not going to
Mhm.
change, and it gives you a tool to look at all this new, rapidly evolving technology is going to have. Again, if we really thought about it, and again, this is where I look back and say, shame on me. I should have seen this coming about addictive technologies and social media and the effects it's had on people's mental health. We should have predicted that. We should have expected that, and we should have mitigated the effects of that. But it was also a very powerful business force. But again, I think a more central role is if our field is only going to be doing, user research and answering all the
Mhm.
questions with user research, we're dead as a field.
Mhm.
For a number of reasons. I talked to Tomer about this in the last episode. Those are the things that are going to be most easily replicated by AI. That's where we're most
Mhm.
vulnerable, particularly on
Right.
the low end research.
Right.
Where we're going to be most resistant, and I won't say totally resistant because I know the way this is going to go to
Mhm.
AI, is this deep understanding of human behavior and
Mhm.
connecting all of these variables together in a particular context, and then coming up with decisions in a very nuanced way and weighting things, very carefully in terms of the variables that are in play. AI is going to have a hard time doing that. So I think
Mhm.
I think we're at a moment in time. I'm coming full circle. I'm coming back that it really is about the human factors. Don't shy away from it. Actually, be proud of it. I've actually started counseling students the last couple of years when the job market for UX has gotten a lot tighter. I said, don't be afraid to look for human factors jobs. Do
Mhm.
not be afraid to say what differentiates you is that deep understanding of human factors. So
Mhm.
having leaders, going back to what you were saying, having leaders that get that, and I've done training, executive sessions with people where I explain this, saying like, you're not going to be doing this, but you're going to be supporting the people. You're going to be
Mhm.
enabling the people, or you're going to be obstructing them, one or the other. If you're not enabling and supporting and facilitating, you're obstructing.
Right.
And how do you become that better leader? And
Mhm.
again, how do you balance that against those hard business decisions that tech leaders are making, every day? That it's all
Mhm.
about the money at the end of the day.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's exactly what you're saying, in terms of just really making that decision and then, making your every move about that, right? And saying, okay, we're going to do this from a human factors perspective and not merely sort of this, much more surface
Yeah, and
sort of
and they don't
perspective.
have to be opposed to one another. Again, this notion
Right.
of profitability. In fact, they're compatible. That
Yep.
one is, towards the end of my consulting career, I was doing less research and less usability testing, and then
Mhm.
just advising and counseling people based on that deep expertise that came out of human factors. I could bring them the solution so much quicker than saying, like, give me
Mhm.
4 weeks to do this study, or
Right.
let's go through multiple rounds of usability tests. Now, at the end, I
Yeah.
would have to do a little bit of research and a little bit of testing to answer the
Sure.
things that I couldn't answer, but I would
Right.
minimize it by 60, 70%. And I'd move
Mhm.
product to market quicker and probably better in most
Mhm.
cases.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think that's it. I think again where people, have complained about, and again, particularly with the silly research that's been going on in a lot of groups right now that's not delivering high value, we're delaying, we're costing money, we're costing, delay to the marketplace, and we're not really, when we get there, we're not producing value, we're not demonstrating value. So I think the two
Mhm.
can be compatible.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no question, right? I feel like I've staked my whole career on that proposition
Oh,
that
I know. I
that
look
it's
at I
that
look at look at any product that you have in your life, like the thing that's tortured me for probably the last 7 to 10 years was we shifted over to Workday as our enterprise system. The number of hours devoted. So I'm a highly paid academic that should be educating and developing new curriculum and new programs. And I was spending 15, 20% of my time learning a poorly designed system. Things that
yes.
I could do mindlessly in the past were requiring 10, 15 minutes of effort. So I mean, there's no shortage, and we shouldn't just pick on Workday, but there's no shortage of examples. Everybody has that example in their life of where it's
Absolutely.
taking away from your primary responsibilities and the primary value that you bring to the organization, and you're devoting it to something needlessly because of bad design.
Hmm?
And we have to make that business case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's the whole point. I definitely got that from the program as well, right? Just the whole idea of this, make that business case, be able to speak that language and, take your sort of human factors, foundational language and, put that into business speak and have those conversations, right? It's really critical.
Yeah, and I think you were talking earlier about persuasion. How do you persuade people to come along? And sometimes you talk about again reducing that kind of waste that I just described. For some clients it has to be liability.
Mhm.
Where you look at companies that are being sued tens of millions of dollars because of faulty product design, particularly like in medical devices and the like. A lot of that is avoidable, and it was
Right.
predictable. And again,
Hmm.
now you didn't want to do it right in the beginning, but you're paying tens of millions of dollars because of bad design. So
Right.
again, that's a business case as well. So we
Mhm.
have many tools in our arsenal to convince people to come along. You'd like to think they do it just because it's good for people. Yeah, that works for some people, but not all. We can't be naive about it. So sometimes
Right.
we have to, be threatening in terms of that exposure and liability. And sometimes it's these unintended costs of taking people away from their primary, work responsibilities. But that can be quantified and that can be delivered.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and you just said a key word, as someone who's been squarely in the qualitative research zone, to your point, just saying the word quantify, that's
Mm.
exactly what I learned to do, right? Was quantify
Yeah.
everything because
Yeah.
we can have these wonderful anecdotes and these great stories, which are the beginning, but you've got to have the numbers typically to convince
Yeah. Yeah.
people
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
experience. And so, and once you have that, then that's a lot more persuasive.
No, absolutely. When you look at everybody else in the organization, the tech organization or the business organization is quantitatively trained. Okay.
Right.
Our
Yeah.
field is pretty unique, being focused largely on the qualitative for most of our the time we've been in existence. We're becoming more quant oriented now. But again, we're not speaking the language of business many
Right.
times.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Well, Bill, I could talk forever and hear more from you forever. Do you have anything else that you would like to say about this topic before we close out? I know
No,
we're wanting to keep these conversations kind of bite-sized, so I want to be
yeah, no,
respectful of your time.
yeah, it is just again, it just keeps coming back to, I think about the name changes that I've seen since the early 1980s, as we as we've labeled this field, and it keeps evolving. And at the end of the day, it's about human-centered design. It really is about a deep understanding of people. And yeah, there's always going to be discovery from our research and things like that, but it's every professional's responsibility to have this kind of foundational understanding of how people operate. Not everything should be discovered over and over again throughout our research. And I think that's
Mhm.
lacking, not from graduates of our program, but I think for a lot of the professionals in our field.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm hearing you talk about is really just having those principles at your fingertips,
Yeah,
being able to speak to
yeah,
those and being able to operate through that lens versus like you said, replicating study after study and
yeah.
reinventing that every time. Yeah.
Answering those questions that we can answer, and
Yep.
and knowing what we don't know.
Right.
And when we come across something that we don't know, then that's when we do our research. So I'm not speaking against research. It's just that I think we're doing a lot of unnecessary research. I think we're doing a lot of unnecessary testing. I think we're doing a lot of unnecessary A/B testing and all of that. Again, is again answering those things with confidence and supported by evidence.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. That's excellent. Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. This has been really fantastic. I really appreciate all your insights today and getting the opportunity to talk to you about them.
Oh, and thank you, Anne, for doing it. It's been a pleasure just being with you.
Thank you to our audience for joining us for the third installment of our monthly interview series with Bill Gribbins. Stay tuned as each HFID board member has the privilege to continue these conversations with Bill each month for the next year, exploring various topics and capturing his invaluable legacy. We will be sharing each monthly interview on the last day of each month on our LinkedIn Bentley HFID alum and student network group page. Thank you.